April 7, 1760. The sun has not yet broken the horizon over St. Mary Parish, Jamaica, but the air is already heavy with the humid weight of canefield mist and the faint tang of iron from the sea. In the dim gray of Easter morning, a single church bell tolls, its echo folding through the blue mountain foothills like a slow, uneasy heartbeat. On most Easters, planters would wake to a liturgy of celebration, plantation houses stirring with coffee and rum, servants in pressed livery, but on this morning a different sound drifts across the hills, the wet silence of blood on soil. The first colonial record of that day is not a witness statement but a dispatch sealed in Kingston and carried to London months later. It survives only as a brittle fragment in the British National Archives, filed under Colonial Office Dispatch 1760, sealed until 1920. The handwriting, slanted and hurried, reads, "The calamity that befell St. Mary Parish must never reach the ears of London in its true form." That single sentence is the closest the imperial government ever came to admitting what happened before dawn, when a man once listed as property became the architect of a massacre meant to shatter an empire. His name was Tacky, recorded in ledgers as Tacky, a Fanti noble from the Gold Coast whose capture and sale to the Ballards Valley estate was noted only as an economic transaction. In an inventory of enslaved laborers dated 1758, an overseer scrawled, "Tacky, male approximately 30, carpenter's arms, strong, defiant eyes." No one reading that dry line could have guessed that 2 years later those same arms would wield a machete sharp enough to slice through the quiet of a colonial dawn. According to a surviving militia memorandum, the attack began while plantation owners still slept in the cool of their great houses. Witnesses, few as they were, described shadows moving between the cane rows, men and women who had spent years cutting those very stalks until their palms calloused into leather. They crept toward the houses with torches unlit, machetes gleaming like shards of moonlight. Dogs barked once, then fell silent. The first victim, planter Charles Swigert, never woke. His throat was opened with a single cut, his body left across the threshold as a warning to any who might run. Within an hour, the uprising spread across several estates, each strike coordinated like the rhythm of a hidden drum. An excerpt from a Kingston militia report, written weeks later in a hand that shook, recounts, "The Negroes seized the powder magazines, beheaded certain masters, and set their heads upon poles as tokens of dread." The report ends abruptly, a single ink blot swallowing the final word, as if the writer could not, or dared not, complete the thought. In the absence of formal testimony, the oral history of Jamaica's maroon descendants fills the gaps. According to elders in Moortown, Tacky's rebellion was not mere chaos but a sacred act, planned under the cover of obeah rituals and whispered in a language the overseers could not understand. One tale speaks of a night when the ancestors themselves walked the fields, promising victory if blood was spilled before Easter sunrise. Whether metaphor or memory, the story lingers like smoke in the hills where the Blue Mountains meet the sea. The British governor's private diary, later discovered in a trunk in Port Royal, notes only, "This island trembles with a terror that must remain unspoken, for if London knew the depth of their rage our sugar empire would sour in the cup." That single sentence carries the weight of an entire nation's fear, the realization that the enslaved were not passive chattel but soldiers with strategy, anger, and a vision of liberation sharp as the blades they carried. And yet, official Jamaican newspapers of 1760 mention only a small Negro disturbance, a phrase so bloodless it borders on obscene. No mention of 60 planters lying dead before church bells finished their morning toll. No acknowledgement of the women who sharpened machetes or the children who carried messages between plantations under the pretense of fetching water. Silence became policy, erasure became law. Imagine the scene when the sun finally rose, the sky burning a cruel orange over fields still damp with dew and blood, smoke rising from cane huts, the once orderly plantations now a sprawl of broken doors and splintered furniture. Survivors, white overseers and their families, stumbled toward Kingston, eyes wide with a fear they could not articulate, their boots tracking crimson mud. For them it was an apocalypse. For those who had swung the blades it was the first taste of freedom, however fleeting. The question that hangs over this dawn is as jagged as the machete that started it. Was this madness, or was it the last weapon left to a people ground beneath centuries of cruelty? Tacky's uprising forces us to confront the brutal arithmetic of slavery, a system where mercy was rarer than rain and rebellion the only calculus of survival. The archives can catalog the dead and count the missing, but they cannot quantify the hunger for justice that drove men and women to risk certain death for a single night of autonomy. Perhaps the most haunting part of this story is not the massacre itself but the deliberate forgetting that followed. Records burned in courthouse fires. testimonies locked in sealed colonial files. Generations grew up in Jamaica and in Britain with no hint of the Easter morning when the enslaved struck back with a ferocity the empire dared not record. Even today, some descendants speak only in whispers, their elders warning them never to say Tacky's name aloud after dark, as if the very syllables still carry the crack of gunpowder and the rustle of cane leaves in a murderous wind. If your own family ever murmured of an Easter when the rivers ran red, if you've seen a name in an old Bible crossed out with a single decisive slash, write it below. Because every comment, every fragment of memory, drags another hidden record back into the light, and the night that justice was served will not stay buried forever. The hills of St. Mary Parish seem tranquil now, washed in the slow gold of Jamaican sunlight, but in the mid-18th century these same slopes pulsed with the relentless machinery of Britain's sugar empire. From the high ridges you could look down and see an endless quilt of cane fields shimmering in the heat, broken only by the white spines of windmills grinding raw stalks into molasses and profit. Ships from Bristol and Liverpool crowded the ports below, their ledgers heavy with pounds sterling and their holds reeking of rum, salt, and sweat. In the year 1759 alone, customs manifests show more than 150,000 hogsheads of sugar exported from the island, a staggering wealth built on backs that official records reduced to inventory numbers. Plantation names like Ballard's Valley, Trinity, and Frontier read today like pleasant rural estates, but in their time they were fortified work camps disguised as homes. The Ballard's Valley estate, where Tacky would one day strike, sprawled over thousands of acres of rich alluvial soil. Surviving estate maps, inked in neat colonial script, record neat grids of cane fields, boiling houses, and the Negro grounds, a clinical phrase masking the barracks where hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children were herded behind fences. Overseer reports from 1758 list nearly 300 enslaved people on that single property, most purchased through the brutal Middle Passage only a few years earlier, their African names shortened or erased altogether in the estate ledger. Life there was calibrated to produce maximum sugar and minimum humanity. Work began before dawn with the ringing of an iron bell, when the sky was still indigo and the air clung wet to the skin. Men wielded heavy cutlasses to slash cane stalks taller than their shoulders, while women and children hauled bundles to ox-drawn carts. The boiling house, an inferno of steam and copper vats, could reach temperatures so high that overseers kept barrels of water at the ready to douse those who fainted before they fell into the syrup. According to a 1757 diary kept by Overseer Samuel Beecham, the smell of scalded flesh mingled with the sweet boil of sugar so that a man could hardly tell which was which. Wages were non-existent. Rations of saltfish and cornmeal barely kept workers alive for the next day's labor. The geography of the plantation itself enforced control. The great house sat on a rise like a fortress, with a wide veranda from which the master could watch every path. Below it stretched the cane fields, the boiling house, and finally the slave quarters, rows of rough wooden huts packed so tightly that the evening smoke from cooking fires hung like a shroud. Militia roads cut through the property, allowing mounted patrols to sweep in if anyone dared escape. Dogs were trained to track the scent of sweat and fear. Runaways who were caught often returned with iron collars whose ringing bells announced every movement. Yet even within this iron system, traces of resistance flickered. Archaeological digs in St. Mary have unearthed charms of cowrie shells and bits of African pottery buried beneath the quarters, talismans for protection and reminders of another life across the Atlantic. Night brought small freedoms, whispered stories of Anansi the spider tricking stronger foes, low drumbeats that carried coded messages through the humid dark, prayers murmured in Twi and Kikongo beside hidden fires. Their songs are prayers but not to our God, Beecham complained in his ledger, uneasy that meaning slipped past his understanding. These subtle acts, songs, charms, secret gardens of yam and okra, were quiet assertions that the people Britain called property remained fully human. Economically, the system was ruthless and precise. Plantation owners calculated profit by the ton and life expectancy by the year. An enslaved African newly arrived in Jamaica was expected to survive 7 years at most, a figure repeated in shipping correspondence between Kingston merchants and London insurers. Death was cheaper than compassion. Replacement shipments from the Gold Coast kept the mills turning. Estate wills treated human beings as capital assets, bequeathing one prime Negro man, sound of limb, alongside silver candlesticks and barrels of rum. Each ledger line, each cold phrase, reinforced the idea that flesh and blood could be tallied like coin. The landscape mirrored this cruelty. Heavy tropical rains turned the cane rows into rivers of mud, where bare feet sank in cuts from sharp leaves festered in the humid air. Mosquitoes swarmed from stagnant ditches, Fevers claimed the weak with terrifying speed. Punishment awaited anyone who faltered. A runaway notice from the Jamaica Gazette, July 1759, describes a Negro man named Kwame, marked by a slice to the ear, to be rewarded with 20 shillings upon return. Such mutilations were both warning and bookkeeping, scars replacing names when records failed. Still, the plantation was never entirely under the master's control. Communication threads tied the enslaved across miles of dense jungle and steep ravines. Market days in Port Maria became covert councils, where coded phrases about weather or harvest carried news of distant kin or whispered possibilities of revolt. The dense interior of the island offered refuge to maroons, escaped slaves who built hidden mountain communities, and their presence was a constant specter to planters who feared an invisible enemy moving through the bush. By the late 1750s, tension coiled beneath the daily grind. Droughts threatened crops, overseers increased whippings to maintain quotas, and rumors of uprisings in Saint-Domingue and Suriname filtered through sailor gossip. Governor Charles Knowles wrote anxiously to London about the dangerous intercourse between the Negroes and the ungoverned Maroons, warning that the seeds of rebellion are watered nightly in the hills. His words, intended as a plea for more soldiers, read now like an omen. Within this crucible of profit and pain, Tacky moved like a shadow both seen and unseen. Estate papers mention him only in passing, a skilled carpenter trusted with tools, sometimes allowed to travel between plantations for repairs. That freedom of movement, rare and grudgingly granted, gave him knowledge of roads, storehouses, and weak points in the colonial armor. Each trip through the dense green hills may have been more than labor, it may have been reconnaissance. The plantation was thus both a prison and a battlefield waiting to be named. Every row of cane concealed a path for flight, every boiling house a cache for weapons disguised as farm tools. To the masters it was a landscape of wealth, to those forced to live and die upon it, it was a map of potential vengeance. When Easter of 1760 approached and the nights grew heavy with the scent of ripening cane, the ground beneath St. Mary Parish held more than roots and stones, it held the slow, relentless heartbeat of rebellion, waiting for a single spark to set the fields alight. If the great house at Ballard's Valley proclaimed the planter's power in bright white plaster and tall verandas, the real story of the plantation lay hidden in the ink of its ledgers, ink that tried and failed to reduce human lives to columns of property and profit. Among those fading entries we find the man they recorded as Tacky, spelled differently in different hands. Tacky, Tacky, Tacky. In the account book dated August 1758, a clerk wrote with brisk efficiency, purchased, male Negro, age about 30, Fantee country, sound of limb, skilled with timber. Nothing more. No mention that before capture he may have been a minor chief among the Fantee on the Gold Coast, or that he had once commanded men in coastal skirmishes against rival states. The British trader who bartered for him on the wharves of Anamabu likely cared only for his strong carpenter's arms and the price he would fetch when the slave ship Britannia reached Kingston. The ledger speaks of families only by omission. Tacky's kin, parents, siblings, perhaps a wife or child, vanished into the Atlantic's dark arithmetic, their names unrecorded as the ship's manifest listed simply cargo, 98 prime. Historians searching the Royal African Company's papers find only a faint possibility. A boy called Kwame Tacky, age 5, shipped months later on a different vessel bound for Barbados. Whether that child was Tacky's son or merely shared his name, the archive offers no answer, only a silence that feels deliberate. For the enslaved, family ties were fragile as spider silk stretched across an ocean gale. On Jamaican soil, those who became Tacky's companions and confidants were bound to him not by blood but by the shared violence of displacement. Estate inventories name a woman called Abina, washerwoman, 32, purchased the same season. An older man, Cudjoe, driver, valued higher for his experience. A youth, Kojo, marked with an X for illiterate but praised as a swift runner. Their real names, rich with ancestral meaning, survive only as echoes behind the anglicized versions. A baptism record in St. Mary's Parish shows Abina reborn as Mary, a forced Christian identity that may never have touched her heart. These scraps, scattered across wills and manifests, are all that remain of a community whose members loved, quarreled, and hoped in languages the clerks could not spell. Life in the slave quarters forged families from necessity and defiance. At night, after the iron bell released them from the fields, people gathered in narrow huts roofed with palm thatch, sharing meager meals of yam and saltfish, rocking babies whose fathers might be sold at dawn. There, in the flicker of cooking fires, they spoke Twi and Ji, swapped news of distant cousins, and whispered the trickster tales of Anansi, stories that taught survival through cleverness, where the small outwits the powerful. An 1759 missionary diary, meant to catalogue progress of conversion, grudgingly observed, "They sing in a tongue not ours, the melody mournful yet fierce. It is not the Lord they praise but their own spirits." In those songs, the enslaved stitched their own genealogy, one that the ledgers could never erase. Marriage, when it happened, had no legal recognition. A couple might pledge themselves before elders or beneath a sacred silk cotton tree, exchanging tokens carved from bone or shell. Children born of such unions inherited not their father's names but their mother's strength, because sale or death could tear families apart at any moment. Overseer notes from 1757 record with chilling brevity: "Girl child, mother Abina, father unknown, value £12." Yet oral histories collected from marooned descendants centuries later speak of careful rituals. Newborns bathed in water mixed with crushed calabash leaves, prayers murmured to ancestral gods for protection from the whip and the auction block. Tacky's own role within this fragile lattice of kinship was complex. As a skilled carpenter, he moved between plantation sites, repairing mills and constructing boiling vats, a position that offered rare mobility and a measure of trust from overseers. That same trust allowed him to nurture relationships across estates, ties of friendship, alliance, and perhaps forbidden love. A faded runaway notice from the Jamaica Mercury in early 1760 warns of "a carpenter Negro called Tacky, speaks good English, may be harbored by kin in Port Maria." Whether literal kin or the broad kinship of shared struggle, the phrasing suggests that Tacky's network extended beyond Ballard's Valley into hidden corners of the island. Even within brutal confines, family traditions persisted. Women braided intricate patterns into children's hair, designs passed down through generations, some say doubling as coded maps for escape routes through the hills. Healers gathered herbs under moonlight, mixing teas that soothed fever and whispered to spirits. The British planters saw only superstition. The enslaved recognized a living archive of African science and memory. When a baby's first tooth broke through the gum, elders tapped a drum 3 times, a signal of endurance. The child had survived the deadly first months and carried the lineage forward despite the empire's intent to erase it. Every colonial document tries to flatten these lives into numbers. Estate ledgers record prime field hands, 243, children under 10, 38, infirm, 12. Yet behind each digit stood a web of relationships, griefs, and quiet joys. Archaeologists excavating the site of a slave village near St. Mary uncovered beads of blue glass and fragments of carved wood, tokens likely exchanged as love gifts or protective charms. These small artifacts speak louder than the overseer's cold handwriting, testifying that amid whips and chains, the enslaved preserved something indestructible. The family, as the colonists understood it, could be broken by sale or death. But the community that Tacky called family, those bound by common suffering and clandestine hope, proved more resilient. It was within this invisible kinship that rebellion could take root, for each person carried not only private pain but the memory of an Africa that had not consented to forget. Names in the ledger could be altered or struck through, but the people behind them carried ancestral stories like embers under ash, waiting for the right wind to flare into flame. Before the first rooster crowed, before even the horizon began to pale, the iron bell at Ballard's Valley clanged through the thick Jamaican darkness, tearing sleep from the weary bodies of the enslaved. It was not a bell of invitation but of command, a sound that turned the night itself into a weapon. Overseer Samuel Beecham recorded in his 1759 diary, "The Negroes rise at 4 of the clock. They have half an hour to light their cook fires and eat what they have, then to the fields until nightfall." Those few lines disguise an unending cycle of exhaustion that defined every day. Men and women stumbled from their cramped huts, shoulders stiff from yesterday's labor, skin welted from the lash, and trudged to the cane rows that shimmered faintly in the starlight like endless blades of glass. The work was punishing in ways numbers cannot convey. Cane stalks, taller than a man and edged like saws, sliced the skin of those forced to cut them. Workers swung heavy cutlasses for 16 hours or more, stooping and twisting until their backs locked in a permanent bow. When the tropical sun climbed high, the air turned to a weight that clung to lungs and blurred the eyes, but there was no pause except to swallow a mouthful of tepid water. Overseers rode between rows on horseback, pistols at their belts, whips dangling like serpents ready to strike. "Those who falter," Beecham noted without emotion, "are to be flogged at once, lest idleness spread." After cutting came hauling. Women and children staggering beneath bundles of cane so heavy the stalks left bruises across their shoulders. The boiling house was a separate hell. Inside its stone walls copper vats of sugar syrup hissed and popped, the air so hot that clothes clung like wet paper. Slaves stirred the thick liquid with long paddles, their faces slick with sweat, the smell of caramelized sugar mingling with the acrid scent of singed flesh. A single misstep could mean a plunge into scalding syrup. An 1758 entry in the St. Mary coroner's ledger reads simply, "Boy of about 12 fell into copper and expired." No name, no family, only the estate's loss of property value. Illness and injury were constant companions. Cane leaves sliced ankles into ribbons. Festering cuts attracted insects and rot. Mosquito-borne fevers swept through the quarters with merciless regularity, leaving the huts filled with the rasp of labored breathing and the quiet weeping of mothers. Burial grounds at the edge of the fields grew crowded, the graves shallow and unmarked. A visiting Anglican minister wrote to the London Missionary Society that the dead are interred quickly and without record as if they never breathed. For the planters, death was merely a cost of doing business. Replacement ships arrived monthly from the Gold Coast, their human cargo insured and catalogued with meticulous care. And yet, in the thin hours of night after the bell ceased its tolling, life, real human life, persisted. When the overseers retreated to the great house and the moon lit the packed earth lanes of the slave village, the people of Ballard's Valley found moments of stolen freedom. Around small fires they cooked stews of okra and yam, the recipes carried across the Atlantic in memory alone. Old women hummed in Chui and Kikongo, songs that braided grief with a fierce undercurrent of defiance. The rhythm of a goatskin drum might begin softly, almost imperceptible, then grow into a pulse that carried through the trees. These gatherings were more than comfort. They were acts of quiet rebellion, a way to preserve an identity that the whip could not erase. Folklore thrived where written records were forbidden. Children listened wide-eyed as elders recounted tales of Anansi the spider, who outsmarted larger beasts through cunning and patience. The stories were lessons in survival disguised as entertainment, metaphors for enduring and undermining a brutal system. Secret meanings threaded through the words. Advice on when to plant hidden gardens of cassava, signals for meeting places in the hills, warnings of an overseer's cruelty. "They speak in riddles," a frustrated missionary complained in 1757, "and I cannot discern if their jests mask darker intents." He was correct. Religion, too, became a vessel of resistance. Some adopted fragments of Christianity, blending them with ancestral beliefs. Sunday gatherings might begin with Anglican hymns and end with whispered invocations to the spirits of Africa, what planters dismissed as obeah, but what the enslaved knew as a lifeline to ancestors who had not abandoned them. Herbs gathered under the new moon became medicines and charms. Chalk symbols drawn on hut floors called on protective powers. The colonial government passed laws making obeah a hanging offense, fearful of the unity it inspired. Silence itself was a strategy. In the presence of overseers, lips stayed sealed, eyes lowered. But beneath that outward compliance lived a current of information and intent. Messages traveled from plantation to plantation through traders, lovers, and market women. A phrase about weather might carry news of a runaway's safe arrival in a maroon settlement. A casual remark about a new shipment of tools might hint at weapons being hidden in the cane. This underground communication formed an invisible network that the masters could never fully sever. The psychological toll was as deep as the physical scars. Children grew up learning that any friend, parent, or sibling might be sold without warning. Trust had to be rebuilt every day. And yet those bonds formed again and again, a testament to human resilience. Marriages, though unrecognized by law, were celebrated with secret ceremonies. Small tokens, beads, carved wood, a scrap of bright cloth, became heirlooms passed hand to hand when words could not be spoken. For Tacky and his companions, this daily crucible forged not only endurance but clarity. Each lash of the whip, each lost child, each song sung low under the stars taught that the masters would never willingly grant freedom. Life under the yoke was a long education in the impossibility of compromise. The plantation sought to crush spirit as thoroughly as it crushed cane, yet in the hidden spaces of night and memory, a different lesson took root, that survival alone was not enough. The quiet drums, the coded stories, the unbroken eye contact when overseers looked away, all of it whispered a single dangerous truth. The chains could be broken, and when the moment came, the fields themselves would rise in flame. By the spring of 1760, the humid air along Jamaica's north coast carried a tension that no ledger could record, though hints of it flicker like static in the archives. A March entry in the St. Mary Parish Vestry Minutes laments unseasonable unrest among the Negroes, with talk of runnings away and insolence, and the handwriting presses so hard into the paper that the quills splintered. Overseers wrote of cane yields dropping despite forced overtime, of workers whispering in languages they could not understand. Something, unseen, uncounted, was gathering. Tacky, once a respected trader and military leader in the Akan Wars of West Africa, walked the fields with an outward calm that masked the soldier's memory. Oral histories collected a century later among Maroon descendants recall that he carried himself like a chief even in chains, his posture straight as the cane stalks. He had been stolen from the Gold Coast not many years before, his knowledge of tactics intact despite the Atlantic's violence. To the planters he was merely another laborer, to those who shared his nights he was a quiet center of gravity. The breaking point did not come from a single cruelty but from 1,000 daily humiliations sharpened by sudden sparks. In early April, an overseer's drunken rage left an elderly woman dead from a whip-stroke, her name already lost to the records. 2 nights later, a fever swept the huts and infants wailed for mothers too weak to rise. Then came a rumor, carried by a market woman from the next parish. A new ship from Africa had brought men who spoke Tacky's dialect, fighters captured from the same wars he once commanded. They slipped messages like dry tinder from plantation to plantation, a pattern too subtle for the masters to see. Even the natural world seemed to conspire. The rainy season arrived late that year, parching the cane until it cracked underfoot, the brittle stalks rustling like whispers of gunpowder. The ground itself feels restless, one planter's wife noted in a letter to her sister in Kingston, dated April 14, 1760. I cannot sleep for the sound of wind in the fields, it is as if the island is waiting. Night after night, small gatherings formed under the almond trees where the shadows thickened. There, elders recited the stories of the Ashanti rebellions. Warriors described ambush tactics and the timing of moonrise. Women brought bundles of dried cassava and goat meat to be hidden along escape routes. Drums, banned by colonial edict, were replaced by the steady beat of wooden pestles striking mortars, a rhythm that sounded like meal preparation but carried coded signals. According to a fragment from the diary of planter Jonathan Ridley, the slaves now hum some mournful tune when they work and cease when approached. He dismissed it as superstition. It was in fact a countdown. Weapons appeared as if conjured. Machetes meant for cane cutting, iron tools sharpened to a spear's edge, flintlock muskets traded for secretly grown provisions through Maroon intermediaries. Folklore holds that Tacky himself visited the island's eastern Maroon settlements, negotiating in the dense mountain forests where colonial patrols dared not linger. There, beneath the breadfruit trees, he is said to have sworn an oath that no child would be born in chains if the spirits favored them. Whether the meeting is fact or legend, the effect was the same. Confidence spread like wildfire through the quarters. The rebellion's opening signal was set for the Easter season, when plantation families would be distracted by church services and feasts. A captured scout later testified, under the lash, that Tacky's chosen hour was just before the cock crowed, when the moon sits high and the cane glows white. Every detail served both strategy and symbolism. Easter promised resurrection, and a moonlit night would light the path while confusing half-asleep overseers. Meanwhile, the British colonial administration sensed only a vague unease. The April 20th dispatch from the governor's office to the colonial secretary in London mentions isolated misbehavior, but assures that the island remains in good order. Those words, written in an elegant hand and sealed with red wax, were already obsolete by the time the ship carrying them left Port Royal. In the slave quarters, final preparations took on a sacred gravity. Women braided charms of red cloth and cowrie shells to guard their sons. Elders whispered prayers to the Abuzum, the Akan deities, mingling them with Christian psalms learned under duress. Children were lulled to sleep with the same Anansi tales, but the storytellers' voices trembled with anticipation. Tacky moved quietly among the huts, speaking few words, his presence alone enough to steady nerves. A Maroon elder's oral account recorded in the 1890s recalls, he told them the spirits of the ancestors marched beside them, that the sea itself would remember their names. As dusk deepened on the eve of the uprising, the horizon bled a copper light over the cane fields. The air hung thick with the scent of crushed grass and distant rain. Somewhere beyond the hills, a drumbeat, so faint it could have been the pulse of the earth, began to mark the hours. Mothers held their children longer that night, pressing foreheads together in silent promises. Men sharpened cutlasses until they caught the moon's reflection like a cold flame. In the great house, the planters slept behind unlocked shutters, their dogs restless but unheeded. Overseer Beecham scrawled a final note in his journal before bed, "The Negroes strangely quiet this evening." He set down his quill, unaware that the very silence he found suspicious was the sound of a world about to break. And in that silence, as the moon climbed higher and the cane rattled in the warm wind, Tacky looked across the darkened fields. Every injustice, every scar, every unmarked grave had led to this moment. The island held its breath. The spark was ready to fall. The night of April 7, 1760, unfolded like a storm with no clouds, sudden, soundless, and unstoppable. Records that survived in fragments give us only glimpses. A blood-spattered page from the St. Mary Parish log, the smudged ink of a plantation ledger where the clerk began to record disturbance of the most, before the line cuts off. Oral memory fills the silence. According to Maroon elders interviewed in the late 19th century, the moon burned white as iron when the first machete was raised. Tacky moved through the cane like a phantom. He wore no insignia, only the scars of his Akan wars, and carried a long machete honed for days to a near-mirror shine. Around him, men and women emerged from the shadows. Farmhands, cooks, cane cutters, each gripping a weapon that had tilled soil hours earlier. The wind carried the smell of wet sugar and crushed grass. Even the night insects seemed to fall quiet. Their first target was the frontier estate. Overseer Beecham's dog barked once before a cutlass found its throat. Witness accounts from terrified survivors, preserved in a colonial militia report dated April 12, speak of a sudden rush. The Negroes fell upon the house as a wave upon rock, doors splintered, lanterns cast down. By the time Beecham stumbled from his quarters, the courtyard was already awash in torchlight and the screams of the startled gentry. From estate to estate the rebels moved, a tide of vengeance rolling east along the coast. Fires leapt from cane field to cane field, turning night into an inferno visible for miles. One planter's widow later testified that she awoke to a red sky and the unmistakable reek of burning sugar, like blood and honey mixed. Muskets cracked sporadically, but most masters never reached their guns. They were dragged from beds or cut down at their own dinner tables. Folklore insists that some rebels recited Akan war chants as they struck, a rhythm older than the island itself. At Ballard's Valley the great house doors were barred too late. Servants, long assumed docile, turned their kitchen knives inward, cutting down the master before he could cry for help. An enslaved girl named Amma, known only from a single runaway ad printed years later, is said to have poured lamp oil across the drawing-room floor and set it alight with a coal from the hearth. Flames clawed up the mahogany paneling, throwing grotesque shadows across portraits of the very men who had once sold her family. By dawn, the rebellion's opening wave had claimed an estimated 60 white lives, though the official count was quickly obscured. Governor Henry Moore's private letter to the Earl of Halifax, still housed in the British National Archives, admits to a loss most grievous, the particulars of which must remain in confidence lest panic spread to London. He ordered clerks to record only a small disturbance among the Negroes, instructing that certain names be withheld for the good of the colony. Yet the island could not hide its wounds. Travelers approaching St. Mary from the west reported miles of cane reduced to blackened spines. Streams ran the color of rust. Cattle wandered ownerless through smoking fields. Survivors staggered to neighboring estates, their clothes singed and eyes hollow. A sailor anchored off Port Maria swore he heard a chorus of strange drums from the hills, as if the earth itself rejoiced. The rebels did not simply kill, they claimed territory. Tacky's force seized weapons from the frontier estate's storehouse, muskets, powder, and cutlasses, while dispatching runners to allied plantations. Their plan, pieced together from later militia interrogations, was breathtaking. Sweep west toward Spanish Town, ignite uprisings along the way, and rendezvous with Maroon fighters in the cockpit country. For a few incandescent hours, freedom felt not like a dream but an approaching certainty. But even in triumph they knew the cost. Folklore says Tacky stood atop a rise as dawn streaked the horizon, the sky glowing the same copper hue as the soil of his homeland. He raised his blood-slicked machete and whispered a single Akan word, Asamdwo, peace. Perhaps it was a prayer, perhaps a defiance. No one who heard it lived long enough to explain. The British militia response would be swift and merciless, but in that brief Easter dawn the enslaved tasted a sovereignty no plantation could contain. The smell of burning cane clung to the air like a permanent memory, and the sea carried their war chants far beyond the island's edge. Even the official dispatch that tried to bury the truth could not erase the echo of that night when the enslaved turned their tools into weapons and the world, if only for a heartbeat, belonged to them. Morning brought no sunrise, only a red haze of smoke and panic that settled over St. Mary Parish like a burial shroud. The British governor's office, roused before dawn, sent urgent riders to every garrison. By mid-morning, militia units and maroon trackers moved like hounds across the charred fields, the crack of their muskets echoing through the valleys. Surviving fragments of the Colonial Council minutes, dated April 8, 1760, record the order in stark ink: suppress the Negro insurrection with utmost severity. No quarter to be given. The counteroffensive was immediate and merciless. Militia detachments, many drunk on rum and vengeance, swept through the plantations with dogs trained to rip flesh. Overseers who only hours before cowered under their beds now led hunting parties, their fear curdled into rage. The burned cane fields became killing grounds, the scent of scorched sugar mixed with the iron tang of blood. In one militia ledger, now brittle and brown with age, a clerk lists 32 rebel bodies recovered this day, each entry followed by a single check mark as if ticking off cattle. Captured rebels were given no chance to plead. Governor Henry Moore's private correspondence to the Earl of Halifax, preserved in the British National Archives though long suppressed, boasts of swift justice to deter further insolence. Justice meant spectacle. Prisoners were marched in chains to public squares where crowds gathered, some jeering, others silently weeping. Contemporary newspaper extracts such as the April 18th issue of the Royal Gazette describe men hanged until near death, cut down and then burned to ashes. Women suspected of aiding the uprising were lashed until their backs shone with raw flesh, then branded with hot irons bearing their master's initials. Tacky himself became both target and legend. 4 days militia reports claimed sightings, the rebel chief in red head wrap, a tall Negro with soldiers bearing, but he seemed to dissolve into the island's dense interior. Oral tradition among the Windward Maroons holds that he moved through the high forests like a shadow, aided by runaways and sympathetic Maroon scouts who guided him through hidden ravines. An 1820 interview with an elderly Maroon woman, recorded by abolitionist missionary William Knibb, recounts, "They say the bush itself hid him, that the trees bent to shield his path." Whether literal or metaphor, the image endured. The British could not abide such a phantom. Governor Moore authorized a bounty of £50 sterling, an immense sum, for Tacky's head. It was a Maroon marksman, compelled by treaty obligations with the Crown, who finally cornered him near the cliffs of Port Maria. A single musket shot ended the man who had once commanded an entire coast. His body was beheaded and his head displayed on a pike in the town square, as a warning to all slaves of Jamaica, according to the militia broadside of April 14. Children were forced to march past it. Mothers turned their faces away, but the image burned itself into memory. Yet even Tacky's death did not still the rebellion immediately. Bands of insurgents splintered into the hills, continuing ambushes for weeks. Colonial soldiers combed the forests, burning provision grounds and killing without mercy. Parish burial registers from May 1760 show a sudden, unexplained spike in unnamed interments. Entries marked simply Negro male, cause uncertain, their anonymity another layer of erasure. Missionary letters from the period speak of villages emptied overnight, families swallowed by jungle or grave. The cost to the enslaved was staggering. Modern historians estimate that hundreds were killed in battle or executed afterward, though exact numbers remain elusive because many killings went unrecorded. One rare court deposition by planter William Hines, discovered in a Kingston attic in 1913, admits bluntly, many were dispatched without inquiry, the names never set to paper. Silence was itself a weapon, blotting out lives as effectively as the musket. Among the white planter class, fear hardened into new brutality. The Jamaican Assembly passed harsher slave codes within weeks, stricter curfews, collective punishment for any hint of conspiracy, heavier restrictions on movement and gathering. Overseer diaries from the following year describe increased use of iron collars and spiked masks, devices of terror meant to crush the memory of rebellion. But memory has its own stubborn life. In Maroon settlements, elders sang low songs of defiance, their rhythms echoing the war chants of April. In the quarters of distant plantations, mothers whispered to their children about a warrior who would not bow, even in death. Governor Moore's final dispatch to London closes with the chilling assurance that the island is once again secure and the contagion of revolt extinguished. The phrase lingers like a cold draft through the centuries, a bureaucratic epitaph for an ocean of unmarked graves. Secure for whom? Extinguished for how long? Beneath the official calm, the soil of Jamaica remained seeded with a different story, one of fire, resistance, and a freedom that could not be fully buried. Long after the smoke cleared, travelers reported strange silences in the burned cane fields at dusk, as if the wind itself remembered. And in the hush between night insects, some swore they could hear a low, steady beat, the echo of machetes against the dark, a rhythm that refused to die. When the fires had cooled and the fields lay in black ruin, colonial Jamaica turned to the machinery of justice. What unfolded in the summer of 1760 was less a trial than a ritual of power, staged to reassure planters in London alike that order, white order, still reigned. Surviving documents from the St. Mary Parish Court ledger, bound in cracked leather and now housed in the Jamaican archives, open with a single ominous line: proceedings concerning the late insurrection, to be prosecuted with dispatch and severity. Every page that follows bleeds with a determination to punish, not to understand. Dozens of captured rebels were dragged before hastily assembled magistrates. Many had been beaten or half-starved during the hunts that followed Tacky's death. Some were too weak to stand, their bodies propped upright by militiamen's bayonets. The court allowed no defense counsel, no advocates, and often no translators for those who still spoke the Akan dialects of their birth. Depositions read today carry an eerie stiffness. Prisoner made no reply. How could they, when the English questions were meaningless sounds to ears more accustomed to Twi or Gie? The prosecution relied on confessions extracted under torture. An excerpt from the July 1760 minutes notes that one Kofi did declare, after application of the lash and irons, that he was present at the planning of the massacre. Nowhere does the clerk acknowledge that Kofi's back had been flayed open or that the application included hot coals pressed to the soles of his feet. A second entry describes the Negro woman Amma, accused of setting fire to the Ballard's Valley house, her testimony recorded only as a string of dashes, perhaps the sound of her refusing to speak, perhaps the simple fact that she died on the whipping post before the interrogation ended. Occasionally the official mask slips. A fragment of a letter from Magistrate Jonathan Trelawney to Governor Moore, later found in a Kingston attic, half-eaten by silverfish, confesses unease. These proceedings resemble not the courts of His Majesty but rather the tribunals of war. Yet the planters demand blood. His words were ignored. The Assembly passed a resolution that any slave merely suspected of aiding the uprising should suffer death or other exemplary punishment at the discretion of the bench. Executions followed with grim efficiency. Gallows were erected in the parish square. Iron cages waited to display bodies as carrion for the tropical sun. Witnesses recalled the smell of burning pitch mingling with the sweetness of overripe fruit. Some prisoners were hanged and then left to rot in gibbets at crossroads, mute warnings to every passerby. Others were burned alive, their screams described in a militia captain's diary as a necessary thunder to still the unruly. Drums were forbidden, yet in the crowd hearts beat their own defiant rhythm. Even in death the rebels were stripped of personhood. The final trial entries read like livestock tallies: executed, male Negro name unknown for the crime of insurrection. Executed, female Negro name unknown. No ages, no families, no histories, just the erasure of identity beneath colonial ink. Where names did survive, they were often mangled into English approximations. Kwabena became Kubbin, Abena became Ebony, a deliberate smothering of the languages that had carried them across the ocean. Outside the courthouse, rumors swirled of buried testimonies and suppressed evidence. Sailors passing through Port Maria spoke of scribes ordered to rewrite the record, of witness statements that did not reflect the island's best interest quietly disappearing. A Kingston printer who attempted to publish a full account was warned that his press would be seized for sedition. When a young clerk refused to falsify dates in the execution book, he was dismissed without pay and later vanished from parish rolls altogether. Yet fragments escaped the perch. In the British National Archives, a single dispatch from a Royal Navy lieutenant notes that the Negroes fought with the courage of soldiers and the discipline of seasoned men, a backhanded recognition of their military skill. Another surviving piece, a diary kept by a Moravian missionary, records the weeping of enslaved families forced to witness their loved ones' deaths. Their lamentation was as a mighty wave, and the earth did tremble beneath it. These thin scraps, ink on fading paper, whispers in an old woman's song, are all that remain of a courtroom where justice was never invited. The trials were not meant to uncover truth but to cauterize it, to seal the island's wound with fear and silence. And yet, every missing page, every burned ledger only underscores what the planters could not kill. The story itself carried forward in memory and midnight prayer. The courthouse at St. Mary eventually crumbled, its stones scavenged for other buildings. But locals say that on windless nights, when the moon is high, you can still hear the soft echo of voices rising in a language the judges refused to understand, a reminder that no verdict, however brutal, could silence the defiance etched into the island's soil. By the close of 1760 the rebellion's visible flames had been quenched. but a quieter fire began in the record rooms and chancelleries of Jamaica and London. Planters and Crown officials understood that ink could be as dangerous as machetes. A detailed account of what truly happened that Easter would travel across the Atlantic, feeding abolitionist arguments and alarming investors whose fortunes depended on sugar. So they set about an erasure as methodical as any military campaign. The first cinders fell in St. Mary Parish itself. Surviving fragments of the council's August minutes, rescued generations later from a worm-eaten chest, include a chilling directive: all superfluous papers concerning the late Negro uprising to be disposed of for the public tranquility. Disposed of meant fire. Witnesses in neighboring Port Maria later recalled barrels of documents carried to the courtyard of the courthouse and set alight under guard. The night sky, once lit by cane fields, now flickered with the smoke of ledgers, trial notes, and personal letters curling into ash. From there the suppression moved outward. Newspapers that had first rushed to print lurid details of the massacre were quietly corrected. The April 1760 issue of the Royal Gazette, which originally reported above 60 whites murdered, reappeared a week later with the number halved and the rebels described only as disorderly slaves. Subsequent editions avoided Tacky's name altogether, referring instead to an insurrection of small consequence. Collectors of early Caribbean prints note that surviving copies of the unaltered edition are so rare today because militia agents bought and destroyed them. Even private correspondence was not safe. A letter from Governor Henry Moore to the Board of Trade, now preserved in the British National Archives only because it was misfiled under plant imports, carries a postscript scrawled in hurried ink: "Let not this calamity be given to the press in its true dimensions. We must not feed the appetite of the enemies of the islands." Other governors' papers from the period show suspicious gaps. Weeks missing from diaries, dispatch numbers skipped without explanation, entire bound volumes later found with pages razored out. One clerk in Kingston wrote to his brother in Bristol that he had been ordered to copy the minutes anew and omit the more shocking particulars, warning him to burn the letter after reading. The economic engine of sugar demanded this silence. British merchants feared that tales of organized African soldiers, capable of coordinated strikes, would spark panic in London's coffee houses and among investors in the West India trade. Colonial insurance companies, already nervous about hurricanes and shipwrecks, quietly pressured officials to keep the Tacky affair from becoming a byword for plantation risk. Their influence shows in a memorandum of the Jamaica Council of Merchants. The prosperity of the island requires that rumors of Negro martial capacity be speedily extinguished. Yet, like embers buried in ash, pieces survived. A few plantation ledgers escaped the purge when owners fled with their fortunes to England, locking papers in family chests where descendants later discovered them. One battered account book from the frontier estate, found in an attic in Bath, England, records in neat copperplate the sudden loss of 12 field hands and 4 prime house servants, in April 1760, followed by the terse note, "Cause of departure, unknown." Missionary journals, considered too pious to warrant inspection, preserved eyewitness descriptions of burning cane fields and the wails of the condemned. And of course there was memory itself, which no flame could reach. In the hills, marooned storytellers wove the rebellion into song and drum. They told of papers burned but truths carried in the body, of names that lived in the vibrations of the Abing horn. An oral history collected in the 1890s recalls an elder saying, "The buckra burn him book, but the wind keep the words." Across generations, families who traced their roots to St. Mary whispered fragments of the story at night, always careful to lower their voices when outsiders passed. Centuries later, researchers pieced together these scattered remnants like shards of a shattered mirror. A stray newspaper in a Scottish archive, a ledger page discovered as a bookbinding in Dublin, a sailor's diary tucked into an attic trunk in Liverpool, each scrap restoring another face, another moment of that Easter dawn. But the deliberate gaps remain. Unnamed victims, missing testimonies, the precise number of dead forever uncertain. The British Empire's great paper fire did its work well. Today the official record still bears the scars of that campaign of silence. In many colonial registers the uprising appears as a single bland phrase: Negro disturbance, April 1760. No mention of Tacky. No count of the children orphaned, the rebels executed, the masters slain. Just a few words meant to smother the roar of a people who dared to fight. And yet the suppression meant to erase became its own kind of evidence. Every vanished page is an indictment, every blank space a testimony to fear. The planters believed that if they burned enough paper, history itself would obey. But history, like smoke, has a way of escaping through the smallest crack, carrying the scent of what once was to anyone willing to breathe it in. Long after the last musket fell silent and the official documents were reduced to soot, the rebellion found a second life in the stories whispered beneath the banyan trees and along the humid ridges of St. Mary's Hills. The British governors might have burned their ledgers, but the people carried the memory in their throats, and those memories bent into song, proverb, and myth until fact and legend became inseparable. Elders told of Tacky not as a mere man but as an Obeah warrior who could command storms and vanish into the mist. In night markets, mothers warned restless children that if they strayed after dark they might hear Tacky's horn, a low moan rolling off the hills like thunder, a summons to unfinished battle. A maroon ballad recorded by anthropologist Martha Warren Beckwith in the early 1900s chants, "Tek back de night, tek back de land," its syncopated drumming echoing the cadence of war calls that once rang across cane fields. Whether the words were 18th century or later inventions scarcely mattered. The pulse carried the truth of defiance. Christian missionaries, anxious to fold converts into the church, sometimes adopted the stories as cautionary parables. A Moravian diary from 1824 notes a sermon in which Tacky is recast as a black Moses, a sign that God hears the groan of the afflicted. Yet in the maroon settlements, Obeah priests spoke of him differently. A spirit guide who never died, who slips between river mist and moonlight to whisper strategy to those still resisting the weight of empire. Some tales turned almost gothic. Fishermen along the north coast swore that on moonless nights the sea glowed red where the rebels' blood had mingled with salt water, and that a lone drumbeat could be heard beneath the waves. In the interior, farmers left a libation of rum on certain stones said to mark the graves of unnamed warriors. To ignore the ritual, they warned, was to invite crop failure or mysterious illness. A traveler's journal from 1857 speaks of a roadside silk cotton tree, reputed to harbor the restless spirit of a slave general named Tacky, where villagers refused to cut wood even during famine. These legends served more than entertainment. They were a code, a political inheritance smuggled through time. Each retelling reminded the community that resistance was possible, that the mighty empire could bleed. In this way, folklore became a living archive, preserving emotional truth where the written record had been scorched away. Historian Kamau Brathwaite once observed that in Caribbean memory, the drum is the document. The rhythm, not the signature, kept the past alive. Even as Jamaica's society changed, abolition in 1834, full emancipation in 1838, the story of Tacky's war adapted. Freedmen invoked him during land rights disputes, saying, "Tacky plant first, we plant after." During the labor riots of the 1930s, protesters sang lines strikingly similar to the old maroon refrains. To British ears these were simple work songs. To those who knew, they were passwords linking present struggles to the Easter Rebellion of 1760. Across the Atlantic the legend traveled too, carried in the memories of sailors and the whispered traditions of descendants in London, Bristol, and Liverpool. A dockworker's ballad collected on the Mersey in 1889 tells of a black captain, who broke the cane and the chain, a ghost of Tacky disguised as a sea shanty. In the United States, where West Indian migrants settled in southern ports, fragments of the tale fused with Gullah stories of insurrection and escape. For historians, these living echoes present both challenge and gift. The details are fluid, embroidered by time and imagination, yet each embellishment signals what the official record sought to hide. Courage, strategy, the sense of justice driving men and women to risk annihilation for a glimpse of freedom. Where colonial files fall silent, a grandmother's hushed melody or a fisherman's warning supplies a different kind of evidence, one written in rhythm, smoke, and dream. And so the rebellion survives not only in archives but in the collective breath of a people who refuse to forget. Every drumbeat at a festival, every story of a horn heard in the hills, is a quiet defiance of those who thought a bonfire of papers could erase an uprising. In the marrow of Jamaica's nights, Tacky still walks, neither saint nor spectre, but something older and more enduring, the memory of freedom insisting on being heard. To read the colonial files as if Tacky's war were a single spasm of violence is to swallow the empire's own defense. In truth, his uprising was only one bright flare in a long constellation of revolts that stitched the Atlantic world together with blood and whispered messages of defiance. The year 1760 sits like a dark pearl on a chain of rebellion stretching before and after. Maroon wars in the Jamaican highlands, poisonings on Louisiana plantations, the Great Stono insurrection of South Carolina in 1739, and, half a century later, Haiti's cataclysm that turned a slave colony into a free black republic. British colonial dispatches betray an almost frantic awareness of these connections. In a letter dated August 1760, Governor Henry Moore warned London that the flame of insurrection is not local but contagious. Jamaican planters fretted that news of Tacky's campaign traveled aboard sugar ships, carried in the coded talk of sailors and the secret prayers of dock workers. A single rebel song could leap an ocean, a phrase in Congo or a can slipped between the lines of a work chant, reaching Charleston or Havana like a spark on dry cane. Historians have traced these currents in the thin seams where records accidentally survived. In the South Carolina Gazette of September 1761, a notice about a small plantation fire includes a fleeting aside, "Negroes speak in hushed tones of the Jamaica affair." The phrase is casual, but it proves the reach of the story. Across the Caribbean from Barbados to Grenada, magistrates quietly tightened night patrols and banned drumming, terrified that the beat of the abing, the maroon horn, might echo from Trelawney to Trinidad. The mechanisms of resistance repeated themselves with uncanny rhythm. A whipping too cruel to bear. A clandestine gathering under the moon. The careful distribution of stolen gunpowder, the whispered vow to strike on a holy day when the masters were drunk with their own piety. We hear the same notes in the plot uncovered in Point Capee, Louisiana in 1795, where enslaved men and women planned to seize the fort during Easter. We hear it in the uprising led by Denmark Vesey in 1822 Charleston, where conspirators chose a Sunday to ignite revolt. Easter Sunday, the thin veil between death and resurrection. Time itself became a weapon. Even the erasures rhyme. Court ledgers listing the names of accused rebels often end in smudged ink or abrupt gaps. Plantation journals that once recorded the daily weight of sugar cane suddenly skip entire weeks. In Montserrat, a courthouse fire in 1768 consumed the only known testimony of a slave woman accused of seditious singing. Such accidents repeat across colonies like a dark litany, each ash-streaked archive a silent confession of official fear. Folklore too draws the pattern. Among the Maroons of Suriname, elders speak of a horn that will call the scattered back when freedom is near. In the Gullah communities of the Carolinas, an old praise house hymn warns, "Don't you hear the trumpet sound?" The instruments differ, the languages shift, but the meaning stays. A signal to gather, to fight, to flee. The empire could burn paper, but it could not silence a song. To follow these threads is to realize that Tacky's Machete was never alone. His rebellion was a verse in a larger epic, a chapter in a sprawling, hidden chronicle of black resistance that spanned oceans and centuries. The British Crown tried to present each revolt as an isolated madness, a fever that flared and died, but the truth is a network of memory and courage, alive and humming like a subterranean current. Stand today in the ruins of a Jamaican sugar mill, its stone walls blackened by centuries of rain, and you can feel that current in the air. The silence is heavy but not empty. It vibrates with the echoes of countless footsteps, with the shared heartbeat of people who refuse to be property. Tacky's uprising was not an aberration. It was a signal fire on a long road toward liberation, one of many torches that lit the night and told the world that bondage could, and would, be broken. The sun sets over St. Mary Parish in a copper wash, the same hills breathing the same salt wind that once carried the smell of gunpowder and burning cane. Today goats graze where the great houses crumbled, and children walk past moss-coated stones that were once gallows. At first glance, nothing betrays the weight of 1760. Yet pause and the silence is charged. It is the hush of a story too heavy to stay buried, the breath of a memory that never signed the peace the empire demanded. According to a private letter held in Britain's National Archives, a planter's widow wrote months after the uprising, "Though the rebels are dead, the island is uneasy, as though some presence moves still in the night air." She could not know that her own words would be hidden in a folder marked confidential and sealed for over a century, nor that they would echo a truth larger than her fear, that the rebellion did not end with musket fire or the swing of a hangman's rope. It sank into the soil, into the songs, into the very cadence of Jamaican speech, waiting for each new generation to listen. Walk those ridges at dusk and the landscape itself begins to speak. The breeze catches in the silk cotton trees said to shelter the spirits of the fallen. Drums from a distant festival roll like low thunder, carrying rhythms older than any map of empire. It is not a haunting in the ghost story sense. It is the persistence of a people's will vibrating through time, proof that freedom leaves a resonance no decree can silence. Every rebellion that followed, Haiti, Demerara, Morant Bay, carried an unspoken debt to that Easter dawn. Tacky's name may not appear in most schoolbooks, but his defiance rippled across the Atlantic like a long, dark wave. The British could torch court ledgers, planters could whitewash newspapers, but the memory migrated. In work songs, in coded proverbs, in the pulse of the Abeng. The very absence of documentation became its own indictment, a quiet confirmation that something worth fearing and remembering had indeed happened. As night deepens over the cane fields, the question lingers like smoke. Was Tacky merely a man pushed past endurance, or was he the embodiment of a truth the colonial world could never admit? That bondage was always temporary, because the human will to resist is older and fiercer than any chain? If your family carries a story half told at kitchen tables, if you've seen a name scratched out in an old Bible or heard a melody your elders called the gathering song, share it below. Each memory, each comment, pulls another erased voice back into the light, and keeps the spirit of that Easter dawn alive.